Hi, everyone. Today I have my friend Dr. Shyamala Kiru, mindset and relationship expert, with me today, and we're talking all about high performance relationships and communicating our needs with confidence. I'm really excited for this conversation. Thanks so much for being here, Shyamala. Can you start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I've been just following all the really cool work that you are doing with your Facebook group, and I've really been enjoying it. So it's my pleasure to be here and to support your community. So I'll tell you a little bit about my work. So my training is as a registered psychotherapist and as a registered couple and family therapist. And I've been doing this work for almost 2 decades. So that's kind of like the technical version of who I am and what I do. But what I've come to really love and appreciate probably over the last 5 years or so is just a real appreciation for working really closely with people in more of a coaching capacity. I've kind of come to understand that I really come alive when I coach women in particular, and help them to really dial in those mindset and communication skills that often hold us back. And a lot of that came out of my own struggle with just dialing in my mindset and just having a really hard time, communicating my needs and setting boundaries and asking for what I needed, being assertive, letting people down, like all of these things that I was never really taught growing up. And I think some of that, you and I have talked about this, some of that is cultural, and a lot of it actually isn't. A lot of it actually isn't cultural, but it really is gender specific. I would say that a lot of women truly do struggle with assertiveness skills. And so I think out of my own need of really needing to learn how to navigate my own relationships well, came a real deep passion and interest in supporting other women on that journey as well.
Yeah, and you do it so beautifully. Like we've talked about it so many times, and I've been at the other end of your coaching as well. And you articulate so accurately, and like you hit the nail on the head when
Mm,
it comes to these issues that are really pervasive, and they impact all our relationships with ourselves, with our partners, in our workspace, and also impact the way we move forward in life, how we grow in life. And that's really why I wanted to bring you in here, because as you know, I work with so many women, and women also have this difficulty really communicating their needs and being assertive, and I've struggled with it similar to you, and I see it all the time with my patient population. And it also is like, as we age, we fall into our old patterns, right? And it's so
mhm.
hard, and it takes so much work to start to shift. And sometimes we think that, okay, we'll do a bit of something and then we give up, but ultimately it's a journey, it's a practice, and it's continual work, as you always say, that even you, like being an expert in all of this stuff, you're still working on it
Mm,
continuously, right?
mhm.
So can you share with us what one of the biggest blocks or some of the biggest blocks women face when it comes to navigating their relationships well?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd love to, if I could, like almost give a bit more context to
Yeah.
why we struggle. So I think one of the things to remember with something like communication is that we fall into different communication styles. There's different ways that we can communicate. There are different communication styles. And there are four primary communication styles. And we learn these patterns of communication through our family of origin. So that simply means the family that we grew up in. That would have been your primary caregivers, whether that was your parents or it could have been your grandparents, could have been extended family. But whatever family you grew up in, those would have been the people that would have essentially given you a template for communication, right? So they literally would have said, here's the roadmap. Here's how you communicate your needs. Here are the feelings that you should share. Here are the feelings that you should hide. Here are the needs that are allowed to be expressed. Here are the needs that you should just keep to yourself. And when you're upset, here's what you should do. And when, right? Like it's, and so we're given this unwritten book of rules around how to communicate. And the reason you use the word pervasive, the reason it's such a pervasive problem is because all of this is communicated to us covertly.
Mm.
So no one sat down with their kids and actually said what I just said to you. No one said, listen, Anne, when you're upset, this is the appropriate behavior, and this is the appropriate way to communicate that, right? And these are the only 3 feelings that you're allowed to express in this house. And if you're ever feeling any of these other things, please don't tell me about them. Nobody comes right out and says this to you, but we learn. We learn through modeling, we learn through the interactions, we learn through experiences how to communicate and what is acceptable within our family system. And as children in particular, we have such an innate and healthy need to be accepted. That's a healthy need as a child, to want to be accepted and to want approval and to want safety and security. We don't want withdrawal of love. We don't want conflict. That's all normal and healthy, right? And so we learn at a very young age, how am I going to get my emotional needs met? And how will I use the way that I communicate in order to get those needs met? Right? So that's the big backdrop. And I know that wasn't the exact answer to your question, but we'll definitely get there. But I think that backdrop is so important for us
Absolutely.
to understand and to have, I meet so many women that beat up on themselves because they don't know how to be assertive. Right? And they're like, why can't I get this right? Why do I struggle with this? Why is it so hard? I see other people out there and they're so confident and they're so this and that. And why can't I do it? Right. And my response is always, because nobody ever taught you how. In fact, what you were taught was to do the exact opposite. You were taught to gain love and acceptance and approval through these indirect strategies. Right. And it wasn't, there's no malicious intent often, right, on the part of our caregivers, but this is often the dynamic that we experience growing up.
Yeah. 100%, and I can relate to that for sure. And I know most of my viewers, if not all, will agree with that as well. I definitely have modeled behavior that I saw in my dad. I've also modeled behavior that I've seen in my mom, but it's not
Mhm.
like they were like, here's how you act. It was
Right.
all just absorbed through, and that's how I communicate. And even now, so my family style was, part of it was a little bit passive aggressive. So that's the style that I
Mm-hmm.
took up. And as I moved into, my relationship with my partner, one of the things like very early on that he used to say to me is, I'm not a mind reader. Right? And
Yes.
and whenever I retreat and become passive aggressive, that's the first thing that kind of goes in my mind. He's not a mind reader. I
Yeah.
have to communicate with
Right.
him.
Right.
Right,
Right.
and we kind of expect our partners to be mind readers, or our
Mm-hmm.
families to be mind readers, or other
Mm-hmm.
people to be mind readers. So
Mm-hmm.
I love that
Mm-hmm.
you talked about that, how we get to this place first
Mm-hmm.
before we dive
Mm-hmm.
into like what's actually happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so important because whenever I talk to people, I realize, and I was in the same boat, like this happened, this realization happened for me. I didn't even realize it was a problem. My communication style. I didn't realize it was an issue, right? I thought it was all sorts of other external factors, right? But I certainly didn't look at myself and go, oh, well, maybe I could actually communicate my needs differently. And maybe the way I'm communicating my needs makes it really difficult for the other person to hear me. Right. So I think it's an important realization to have, but also a realization, I hope, that will invite us all into a space of self-compassion around why this is so hard. And I think that's where we need to start this conversation, and any conversation around improving something like communication or mindset or whatever it is that start from that place of self-compassion, that we're doing the absolute best that we can with the tools that have been available to us. But perhaps there are some different strategies and some different tactics and some different tools that can actually get us to where we need to go at this point.
Mhm. So in that vein, how can we understand better like what our style is, or what our
Mhm.
tendency is?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if you want to give your viewers a really, I know you can add like comments or something whenever you post this video, but maybe even just giving them a link to the communication audit that I'm sure you're familiar with. But that is a quiz that I've created that will help you to identify which communication style you fall into. But let me tell you about them. because sometimes all it requires is just a little bit of insight in terms of just labeling and understanding what the different communication styles are so that you can identify which one you're falling into. Okay. So there's 4 main communication styles. The first one that I'll tell you about is the passive style of communication. And so as I'm going through these styles for your viewers that are listening or watching, I would suggest that you try and identify when you personally fall into one of these styles, not when people around you are falling into one of these styles. Because usually what we do with this information is like, oh yeah, that's my mom, or oh yeah, that's my partner.
Yeah.
Right? Well, we all do. I do that too. But what I would invite all of us to do is we all actually fall into all of these styles at one time or another. So just try to identify yourself within these categories. So the first style is the passive style of communication. And that is simply it's expressed by not expressing your thoughts, feelings, opinions, and needs, right? So this is the person that literally is very tight-lipped about what they're thinking, what they're feeling. They're not sharing what they're honestly, what's honestly happening for them in any interaction. And often somebody that falls into the passive style will actually think this is very healthy, because often the untrue belief that associates that passive style of communication is something like, if I don't have anything nice to say, then I'm not going to say anything at all. Like that's sort of the common thing that we can kind of think about. It's this idea that I'm actually taking the higher road because I'm not expressing my opinion, which is different from yours. And the reason this is problematic is because, one, for the person that communicates passively, and I say communicate because even though you're not saying anything, you're still communicating. You're communicating either agreeing, like you're as if you're agreeing to whatever is happening, or you might just be placating the other person, which is just like soothing the other person, saying like, yeah, it's fine, go ahead, you can, I don't know, take up all of my time, whatever it is, right? Like it's that sort of, it's communicating something, right? So you're essentially communicating that my needs are not important. But then what ends up happening, and is we then eventually become resentful that my needs are not as important as yours, right? And it's going to breed bitterness, right? And a lot of negativity. And it actually creates a lot of distance in relationships where someone is falling into that passive style of communication. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can definitely think back to times that I've done that personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
me too, right? Like this is a very, very, very common one. Well, then what happens, and I'll link this actually to our next style of communication that I want to talk about, is often when someone falls into that passive style of communication, it becomes habitual, and they do it for a long time. So they're sort of stuck in that passive style of communication. They're constantly doing it. The resentment is growing, the bitterness is growing, the anger is growing. You get frustrated every time somebody asks you for something because can't they see how busy I am? Like, why do they keep asking me? But you don't say no, right? And then what eventually ends up happening is this person can then flip to the aggressive style of communication where they simply blow up. And they get angry, right? And it doesn't even have to be loud. Sometimes the aggressive style of communication isn't about being loud, but it's about I'm right and you can't see the other person's point of view and I must get my needs met now. And it becomes a very aggressive way of communicating your needs, thoughts, feelings, and opinions and boundaries. Okay. So those two, the passive style and the aggressive style. And I will say with the aggressive style, it's important to note this person is also very motivated by getting their needs met at all costs, right? So they are very tied to the outcome. They have a goal with each and every conversation. It is their goal, and they are not able to see your goal or your interests. Okay, so the aggressive style of communication can come across calm, cool, and collected. It doesn't have to be loud and intimidating for a person to be communicating aggressively. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. So the third style is the passive aggressive style. And I'm smiling only because it's my favorite style to work with. It's a very interesting style.
Very familiar with it.
It's a very interesting, complex, and nuanced style of communication. So it's actually quite fascinating. I have certainly fallen into it. And in all honesty, it is the style that I will move into when I'm under stress. So I've got to be aware of it. Like, it's one of those things I got to be on top of my game, on top of my communication game. Otherwise, it's old patterns, right? They die hard. So the passive aggressive style literally combines elements of both the passive style and the aggressive style. It combines both elements. So this person wants to get their needs met. I must get my needs met. However, I'm not willing to take responsibility for asking for my needs. Okay, so I still need to get my needs met. So for example, I really want you to do the dishes, but I don't want to ask you to do the dishes. I don't want to take responsibility for telling you that I need help. So what I'm going to do instead is say to you, oh, Anne, are you going to sit there and watch TV all night? Oh, because there are some dishes. Oh, okay. Okay, so you're not going to, right. Right. So I'm not going to just, instead of just saying, hey, Anne, do you think you could help me? I need help cleaning up the kitchen. Do you think you could just help me by doing the dishes? I'm going to put the food away. Right. I'm going to communicate it to you passive aggressively. My goal is to get you to do the dishes, but I will not ask for it. I won't own that. And then I might communicate it to you by slamming around the cupboard doors and turning on the tap really wildly and furiously washing the dishes myself, because I need you to know that you've pissed me off and you haven't done the dishes. This is the anger. I'm expressing the anger that lies beneath the passive aggressive style of communication. Often what happens is anger builds up, but we've probably been taught that it is not okay to be angry and to express anger. It is impolite. Do not rock the boat, right? Just suck it up, be a martyr, do what you need to do. Right. So this is often the messaging that comes along with the passive aggressive style. And so all three of these styles are highly ineffective at getting your own needs met and at building intimacy, right? Plain and simple. So the fourth and final style of communication, and this is really the only style of communication that is healthy. It is the only style of communication that actually fosters authentic intimacy in relationships. And I believe this is true in personal relationships as well as professional relationships. And that's the assertive style of communication, right? So the assertive style of communication is about communicating directly your needs. It's about being, there's so many beautiful elements. I love this style of communication, not because I get it right all the time. I don't, but it is truly what I aspire to do in all of my relationships, because it is the only style of communication that is mutually respectful in a relationship. And it is the only style of communication that allows you to truly act with integrity in a relationship, that allows you to truly move into transparency and authenticity. And it is the only style of communication, I believe, that allows us to really communicate with confidence, as I always say, right? It's the only one that actually feels good. It's the only one that feels good. All the other ones are anxiety provoking, right? It's the only one that actually feels good. And it really is, there's a few elements to this style of communication. One, you have to be in a place where you're emotionally self-regulated, right? Meaning you're not going in hot when you're having these kinds of conversations. You're not going in with the anger and the bitterness and the frustration and the like, I just can't take it when you blah, 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 blah. That's not assertive. Right? That's aggressive, right? So we want to make sure that we're self-regulated. We're really clear on what it is that we are asking for. And when we go in to have one of these conversations, we want to ask in very concrete and behavioral terms, right? Like, you never show me that you love me, right? I need you to show me that you love me. That's not assertive, because showing someone that you love them looks different in every single relationship. Right? So it's about being a lot more concrete. I've really missed the amount of time that we used to spend together. We've both become so busy, right? Could we have a look at our schedules, and can we plan a movie night? Could we plan a date night? Could we, set aside some time to spend together? There's something I need to talk to you about, whatever it is, right? The key though with assertive communication is, and this is the hardest part of it, I would say, is that we have to be willing to let go of the outcome in order for that conversation to be mutually respectful, right? So I can ask you for what I want and need, but I have to love and respect you enough to give you the freedom to say no.
And I love that every time you say it, because
Yeah.
even though it's so simple,
Mm.
we're so attached to the outcome of something we can't control, which is the other person's response,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's why I love hearing it. So please say it again.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say it again because here's the thing, guys, is it like human nature, we all want certain outcomes. I want my husband to show me love the way that I want to be shown love,
Yeah.
right? I want him to do things a certain way. I want him to watch the shows that I want to watch. Right? Like that's normal and that's human. But what I think we need to move to is, can I get to the place and to this incredible sense of emotional maturity where I actually take full responsibility for my happiness? I don't put that on him. I still ask him for what I want, but I truly give him the freedom to say, no, I'm so sorry, I can't do that tonight. Or actually, you know what? I'm just not comfortable with doing X, Y, and Z at all. Right. And that not change our level of intimacy or my behavior or my moods. Right. That for me is what, and I'm not there yet. I'm still on this journey of getting there. And it's like a moment to moment journey of remaining grounded enough in myself and confident enough in myself and loving enough towards him that I can do that. Right. And it's a lot of work, and it's much harder when we're stressed or when we're tired or when we're whatever it is. Right. But that's for me what assertive communication is. And that's for me how it actually builds authentic connections, is because you're essentially saying to the other person, I've got me under control. Like I'm going to take care of me. And that doesn't mean I don't say to my husband, like, I'm having a really hard day, but it's not up to you to fix my hard day. But could I talk to you about it? Right? Could I tell you what I'm struggling with right now? And it allows him the freedom to listen and to lean into that conversation without feeling the pressure to fix it or change it for me.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's such an important aspect of communicating, right? And in my practice, to share that with you, I see a lot of women, I see a lot of patients going through their fertility journeys or
Mhm.
having some kind of transition in life. For example, around perimenopause, there's a lot of changes happening health-wise, mental health-wise, like in all areas. And because we've fallen into these patterns and we have these fears about, the outcomes of what's going to happen next, I find that a lot of women have a lot of fear communicating what they're
Mhm.
feeling with their partners, and
Mhm.
oftentimes making up their responses as well. Like, this is what he's going to say, or he might not take it well, or what if he disagrees? So, how do we
Right.
navigate gracefully accepting a no or a disagreement? How do we do that?
Right, right. It's a great question. I think for me, it begins with really, really understanding that my responsibility in a relationship is to be honest and to really show up um, as fully myself as I possibly can. And I say that carefully because I think showing up fully is a journey. Like I think I still have parts of myself that I haven't fully shown my partner, right? And there may be parts of myself that I haven't even shown myself. So this idea of hiding parts of ourselves is just human. Like it's just what we do, right? It doesn't mean we're broken. It's just we're on this journey, right? And so I think part of it is understanding on a very deep level, and that my responsibility, if I want to have amazing relationships, and I think that probably your viewers and your community want to have amazing relationships. If I want to have amazing relationships, my responsibility is to be really honest and really transparent about the good and the bad and the ugly that's all inside of me, right? And to be totally honest about that. And my partner has an equal responsibility to that. And if I'm going to facilitate another human being showing up as themselves, then I have to give them the love and the respect and the space to disappoint me. And that disappointment is, in fact, a real element of high performance relationships. Like, it's embracing this idea that disappointment is totally okay and it's healthy, right? That we're going to disappoint each other. So for me, that's the biggest piece. I literally remind myself that my partner is not responsible for meeting all of my needs. He's just not. And he's not going to. And he's going to disappoint me. I disappoint him every day. Right? But that doesn't mean that we can't experience this deep sense of love that goes beyond, this, what we can do for each other. Does that make sense? So I think for me, that's how it's like a conversation that I have with myself, where I remind myself, almost like, what's the goal of this relationship? I do this with my daughters. Like, what's the goal of this relationship? She's not going to make me happy. She's going to do everything I want her to do. I have all these goals and dreams for her. She's like, but she's got her own. And I'm going to experience some disappointment around that. Right? I'm going to experience disappointment when she makes choices that I wouldn't have made for her. Right? But the goal of the relationship is to actually show up authentically more and more each day. And so when I imagine myself, years down the road, and as so many of us do, I think, and for example, with my partner, imagine myself growing old with him. I hope that he knows me more deeply then, and I know him more deeply. But we can only get there if we give each other the space and the permission to disappoint each other and let each other down. Like I let him down all the time. Right? And vice versa. Like that's just, but it doesn't mean I love him any less or he loves me any less.
Yeah, and that's the case with any relationship, right? Like we think about child and parent relationships, like you alluded to,
Yeah.
even with my friends, for example.
Yes.
And it's ever evolving too, as you said, as we get in touch with what we're like and what we're growing into, because that changes over time as well. As we discover parts of ourselves and parts of, relationships, it changes over time. But it's so true. Like it's the good and the bad. It's all together. It comes
Yeah.
as a package. Like you can't take one out of the other.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, and I know you talk a lot about, emotional intelligence and mindset mastery, and all of these aspects involve moving through our fears. It's not really that we're not experiencing the
Mm.
discomfort or not experiencing the negativity or whatever it might be, or disappointment, for example. So how can we tap into that emotional intelligence? What is
Mm-hmm.
is emotional intelligence? What does it look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think it's such an important question. And I know that, I've been in practice, like I've said, for almost 20 years. And emotional intelligence has always been a part of mental health, I would say. It's always been a part of kind of what we learn and how we're trained and that kind of thing. But I would definitely say in the last 10 years, I've become increasingly interested in it, because what I think I learned, and I learned it kind of halfway through my career, is the one thing that will get people stuck more than anything else, Anne, is an inability to access the skills necessary to execute on emotional intelligence, right? Like that's what I've learned more than anything else. Like that's the thing that's the thing that got me stuck when I was at my lowest point. I, despite my training and despite all my experiences and all the textbooks, like despite all of the stuff that I knew, um, my inability to actually work through the skills and utilize the skills that would allow me to navigate life with emotional intelligence is what was missing for me. That was like the missing piece of the puzzle. So, to break it down, emotional intelligence simply is the ability to be aware of, the ability to name, and the ability to regulate our own emotions. That's one piece of it. So, it's the ability to be aware of, name, and regulate our own emotions. That's one piece. The other piece of it is the ability to then be aware of and understand another person's emotions. Okay, that's the second piece of it. And then the final piece is then the ability to then navigate your relationships accordingly. Like with this knowledge, it's then how do you navigate the relationships? And so when I work with people around emotional intelligence, I think of two main pillars of care that then lead us towards the third, right? So the first pillar of care I think about is mindset mastery, that, as you alluded to. And for me, mastering our mindset is simply about really taking like this wildly radical responsibility for our own happiness, right? That I am 100% responsible for my happiness. And that for me has become a very empowering reality. Right? It started out scary that, holy shit, I got to take care of my own happiness. And then it became super empowering, like, oh, I can actually take care of my own happiness. Right. So that for me is what mindset mastery is, getting to that place. And I don't always feel that way, right? Sometimes I have to like coach myself to that place again. And then the second piece is the communicating with confidence, which is essentially then from this place where I'm really taking care of my own happiness and I'm taking radical responsibility for my life. How do I then from that place begin to communicate with the people around me what my needs are, what my opinions are, what my thoughts are, what my boundaries are, and how do I also then make space for them to do that with me? And when we have those two pillars, I think, really dialed in, that's when we can move towards my final pillar of care, which is authentic connection. That's what drives us forward to creating those high performance relationships, as I call them, right? Because it's these skills around emotional intelligence that actually allow us to navigate our relationships, you know, and for me, and you've heard me say this, so I might sound like a broken record to you, but I believe it so deeply that, you know, when our relationships are strained, and I think this will resonate for your community, because I know that when you're working with something as sacred as fertility, gosh, that's a sensitive, as I said, like it's a sacred space, right? It's a very, it's a very, very special space to work in, right? And it requires you to be able to navigate your relationships well. And when relationships are strained, when relationships are in distress, I think that's what leads to mental health distress, particularly for women. There's such a strong correlation, right? When our relationships are strained, it really does wreak havoc on our mental health. And so I think that's why it became so important to me. Like, this is kind of how I landed on this whole like obsession with emotional intelligence and helping women navigate this in particular, because I think men struggle with it too, don't get me wrong, and I work with lots of men that struggle with emotional intelligence and navigating their relationships, but I'm deeply passionate about helping women find their voice in this space, right? Because I know how amazing it can feel. And it's like, oh, it's actually okay for me to ask for my needs. And I feel empowered doing it because I've also let go of the outcome, right? So I'm not going into this feeling highly anxious each time.
Yeah, and I love all the work that you do. And I'm so grateful that you do the work that you do because it resonates with so many people, and we need it, right? Like as you said, women have difficulty using their voice oftentimes. So can you share with us as a summary, a
Yeah.
slight summary, what can women who are watching this, what are the viewers watching this, are the first steps that they can implement in their lives maybe currently? That will allow them to communicate more assertively and use their voice.
Yeah, great. I love that question. I'll say this, if I could summarize it, it's hard to. They're such important concepts, but I'll say that, you know, let's be aware that most often we don't communicate assertively because we're afraid that if we do, we will be rejected, right? It's usually that fear of rejection or abandonment, um, of losing approval. That's usually why we don't. So I would invite you to really imagine what it would be like to be loved and accepted fully for all parts of who you are. Like to actually sit in that almost like as a meditative sort of exercise. Like actually imagine what life could be like if you actually allowed yourself to show up as you truly are. And from that place, then begin to take a small risk. I remember when I started this journey, so to make it practical, I was so bad at communicating my needs and I didn't even know what was happening. And I remember it was dating my husband. We were in the car, we're going out for dinner. He's driving, I'm in the passenger seat. And he says to me, Sham, okay, what would you like to have for dinner? Have I told you the story before, Anne?
No.
Okay. Good. Like, I feel like you've heard all my stories. And he says to me, where do you want to go? What do you want to get for dinner? And my answer, I don't know, whatever you want. In that voice as well. Like,
I've used that voice before.
I don't know, whatever you want. And then he says it again. No, really, like, what do you want for dinner? And I don't know, whatever you want. Pulls the car over, stops the car, turns to me and says, Shem, like, really, what do you want to eat? And I just sat there. And it felt so aggressive to me, right? Because I was not used to being asked these really direct questions. And I could go on about how that evening went, but the point is, I realized in that moment that I had never actually thought about what I wanted to eat. Every time he asked me that question during that drive, I never even paused long enough to think about it. Because the only appropriate response in my mind was whatever you want. Because it's just dinner, no big deal, right? I don't need to have an opinion about dinner. But when we don't have an opinion about dinner, we also don't have an opinion about a lot of other things in our life. Right? So where I started to practice and where I would encourage you to practice is pick something really, really small and begin to just ask yourself, what is it that you actually want? Right? And now, if I were to be really honest, I didn't want to make a choice that he didn't want. I didn't want to say, I want a burger and he wants pizza or whatever it is, right? Like, I didn't want to make the choice that he didn't want. Right? And that's often how we navigate our relationships, is we're trying to mind read and just allow the other person to make the choice. So just pick something super small, really, really small, decide for yourself what you want. And then the next step, once you've decided for yourself, the next step is, can you then communicate that teeny tiny little choice to that person and own it as your choice?
I love that. Right. And when you said, even when you said, I can't remember what you said actually, it gave me goosebumps, just like sit in what you want, or like to be accepted fully. That's the point that you made, to accept yourself. Like, what would it be like to be accepted fully for who you are? That gave me goosebumps because we oftentimes don't think about that. We're kind of like going into that space of insecurity and judgment. Like, how will we be perceived? Will this person leave me or reject me or abandon me? And oftentimes we attach our whole self-worth to that.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also love this example that you gave because it's true. Like, I've done that so many times. No, order whatever you want. And then he's like, no, but what do you want?
And it goes, right.
Like you said, you could go on forever about that story because it lasted such a long time.
Right.
Thank you so much for being here, Shyamala. I know you also have tons of resources and audits for your community. So can you share with us where people can connect with you and have access to some of the resources that you're putting out into the world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, like, the most comprehensive resource that I've put out recently that anyone can grab, and it's completely free, is a 10-page ebook. It's linked in my bio and Instagram. I'm sure you'll share all the info, so I won't bother because my name is a bit longer than some, so it might be difficult to spell it. But yeah, that's on my Instagram profile, and you'll probably link it here. But it's a 10-page ebook that essentially helps you to identify the 4 different categories of brain traps that I work with people on, and how these actually will impact your relationships negatively. So the resource is called The 4 Brain Traps That Will Ruin Your Relationship. So I'd highly recommend that. I really like giving that resource out to people because I think it's a really good overview that will help you to begin to understand some of those thinking traps. And then any other resources that I have a bunch of audits, like you've said. I've got like 3 or 4 audits. They're all linked in my Instagram bio. You can grab them there. Podcast episodes are linked there as well. So that's probably the most central place to find all my resources.
Perfect. And like Shyamala said, I'll put a link to all of those resources in the video description. Shyamala, this was such a lovely conversation. Thank you so much. I know so many women will resonate with this message and everything that you've shared today.
Oh, thank you so much, Anne. It's my pleasure. Have an amazing day, guys.